This is Swapna Little, and I'm going to talk today about the Qutub Minar complex and the very distinctive examples of architecture that we see in this different buildings in this complex, and what that tells us about the evolution of Indian architecture in a bigger picture. The image that you see, the photograph that you see, shows us some of the older parts of this complex. There are a number of pillars, and built, these were carved in the 11th century. The story of this complex is tied up with the founding in the mid 11th century of a city, a fortified city by the then Tomar rulers of Delhi. And the founding of the city is credited usually to Anangpal II, the Tomar ruler. And the Tomars were a Rajput clan who ruled over Delhi at that point. They had earlier had a fortified city in what is present day Faridabad and Faridabad district, Anekpur. And in the middle of the 11th century, Anangpal II founded this city. And within this city, there were a large number of temples, and these pillars are a part of that complex of temples. To take just one detail from one of those pillars, if you look at this particular photograph, on the lower part of the pillar, there is a pot. This is known as the Purna Kalash. It's a pot that was filled with Ganga water, and coming out of it are these leaves. These are stylized leaves, not very naturalistic, but on top of that is a carved face. This is the Kirti Mukh. The Kirti Mukh is a device that is used to keep away the evil eye, and often in temples, temple pillars had these common motifs like the Kirti Mukh, like the Purna Kalash carved into them, and this is part of the design vocabulary that is used in these temple pillars as well. The next major change that came about after the Tomars in the middle of the 12th century, Delhi seems to have passed into the territory of the Chauhan rulers, who were also another Rajput clan who had their capital in Ajmer. And then following that, by the end of the 12th century, we have the Turks coming in. The Turks, specifically the Ghori rulers, had, though their homeland was Central Asia, they had expanded into Afghanistan. And from Afghanistan, by the end of the 12th century, we have the conquest of North India, as this map will show. And the ruler who is associated with with that conquest of North India is Muhammad Ghori. And it was his general Qutbuddin Aibak who actually in 1192-93 conquered Delhi. And Delhi then became an important town, a garrison town to begin with, and slowly in time it became the capital of a growing kingdom and empire which we know as the Delhi Sultanate. The immediate impact of the war that led to the conquest of Delhi was a negative one for its architecture, because many of these temples, particularly the ones that had been sponsored by the ruling power, for instance, a large temple that was built by the finance minister Nattal Sahu, these temples were demolished, and these the materials from those temples, for instance, temple pillars, were reused in the making of a large congregational mosque. The mosque, of course, was needed because the conquering soldiers were Muslim and they needed a place to worship. So you can see in this pillar that you see, a human figure that has been defaced and has been used in the mosque, and many of these pillars were then reused to make different parts of the mosque. At the same time, this was also a period of innovative developments, and one of them was a very new concept of arch making. Before the conquest of Delhi by the Turks, we did not have arches being built in Indian architecture. The usual way of covering space was to put up columns and put beams on top of them. And for the first time, these newcomers, they asked Indian builders to make an arch. And Indian builders, of course, did not have any knowledge of arch making. And the conquerors, of course, were not builders themselves, they were only soldiers. So what you have as a result is a very peculiar structure being built, the first experiment in matchmaking. And you can see the details of this particular kind of arch. It is very unlike any proper arch. If you look at how the stones are placed, they are placed horizontally and in layers, and it sort of meets in the top. There are two large stones that meet at the top. Now, this kind of arch is not a true arch. It does not have the dynamics of a true arch, and as a result, it is actually not very stable and not very strong. And therefore, in fact, beneath this false arch, as we may call it, the builders also added a lintel, a beam, a supporting beam to give it extra strength. And of course, on top of the arch, they did not place any other masonry, because they knew that this would lead to the arch becoming it might collapse under the weight of additional masonry. To make this clear, the contrast between this and what is a true arch, let us take an example from another building which is from the 14th century in the same complex. This is from the Madarsa of Alauddin Khilji, a later ruler. But if you compare it to the previous arch, you can see what a true arch really is, because it is made up of these stones which are laid side by side, and as they are laid here, the weight is transferred along the length of these stones, and it is evenly distributed, and this is actually what is known as a true arch. But to come back to the arch which was originally built, beneath that arch, over the lintel, we have the examples of a very different kind of ornament that was also coming in and was creating a very new amalgam of styles. So, first of all, we see that there is a band of writing on top, and this writing is again the Persian script. It is a line which talks about the building of this mosque on the orders of Qutbuddin Aibak. And you can see that this is not elaborate ornamental calligraphy, but rather roughly written. The people who are writing this were obviously just the soldiers, no very sophisticated calligraphers. And those who are executing this were Indian craftsmen, Indian stone carvers, who also were not familiar with the Arabic or Persian script. Below that is a feature that is also very interesting, and this is the Kirti Mukh. Now, these are not reused elements, these are freshly carved for the mosque, but the Kirti Mukh has again been carved because these Indian artisans, these Indian stone carvers, felt that if you are building a mosque, even if it is a mosque, it is a place of worship, and it needs these kind of sacred devices to protect it. And the template for this, the inspiration for this was the motifs that they had used in the previous buildings, the temples themselves. So this is one of the reused pillars which has been used somewhere else in the mosque, which was from the earlier temples. So a very similar style being used as had been used in the temples, now being used in the mosque. A few years after the initial part of the complex was built, the initial part of the mosque was built, a mihrab screen was added to the complex. And it was built in about 1198. It's called the Great Screen of Arches. And really, if we have the idea of this kind of screen is to indicate the direction of Mecca. If you are facing this, you are facing the west, wherein towards which Mecca lies, which every Muslim has to face while praying. So that was the idea of building this screen of arches. But if you have a little closer look, you will see that this famous iron pillar of Mehrauli that is placed in front of it, the iron pillar, of course, was of old 4th century pillar of the Gupta era. It had local importance, and it is quite likely that this mosque was built around this pillar to take advantage of that, the significance that was already imbued in this pillar. And though historians disagree as to whether this pillar was originally in Gupta time installed here or it came later, we do believe that this has been in this place at least from the 11th century. So it was there when this mosque was built. But let us look a little bit more carefully at the carvings which are on the screen of arches itself. And some of these carvings are, of course, calligraphic panels. Now, uh, these some of them are verses of the Quran, and some of them in Persian talk about the building of the mosque itself and the greatness of the people who built it. And this is during the time of this is shortly, as I said, after the conquest that takes place. And these calligraphic panels have not only the writing but a lot of vines and leaves and flowers, particularly lotus flowers. But there is also another kind of motif which I would like to give a little bit of background of it. Now, traditionally, Indian temples, many North Indian temples, at their entranceway had the Ganga and the Yamuna, the two river goddesses, on the entranceway. And this is a sculpture from Rajasthan, dating to the early part of the 9th century. And it shows Yamuna and her attendants, and Yamuna is standing on her Vahan, and that Vahan is a tortoise. And behind the tortoise, you can see the river, the symbol of the river behind her. And this is Ganga from the same composition. And here again, you can see Ganga is standing on her Vahan, which is a makar. A makar is something like a crocodile, and she is standing there. And behind that makar, you can see the makar's tail, which has a sort of wave-like form behind her at the bottom part of this image. And that wave-like part really symbolizes not only the makar, but is used often to symbolize Ganga itself. Now, the placement of these two river goddesses on temples, one good example can be seen from the Telika Mandir in the Gwalior fort, where at the entrance doorway on either side you can see Ganga and Yamuna, the rivers. And if you have a closer look at the panels which are above, which flank that doorway, when you see those panels, you can see how that wave-like pattern is reproduced in these vertical elements to symbolize the two rivers Ganga and Yamuna. And it is in fact these vertical columns, these vertical patterns, which are then reproduced on the screen of arches as well. So what is really happening here is that the Indian builders of the mosque, when they are given their brief by the Turk soldiers, they are told that they must build this place of worship. They may use whatever motifs they like, except that, of course, there are to be no figures, no human, animal, divine figures to be carved on this, because that is not that is injuncted by Quranic prescriptions, so they may not have those. So what they do is that they use things that they do know. They are used to carving the river goddesses. They don't carve the river goddesses, but they do carve their symbols. The wave-like pattern, which is the Yamuna, and that scroll-like pattern which represents the tail of the Ganga, of the Makar, which is the Vahan of Ganga, and that therefore symbolizes Ganga. So these are the kind of motifs that they carve on the screen of arches. There's another kind of motif that is carved on the screen of arches, and this has a scrolling vine with a lotus flower in the middle. And here also we have the model in the complex itself. This is one of the older elements which must have been taken from one of the temples, and it shows a very similar pattern here. But the interesting thing is that this pattern you can see in other places as well, rather far removed from Delhi. And one of those places, for instance, is in Rome. And here, of course, there is no lotus flower and wine, but actually acanthus leaves. And this is from the temple of Venus Gentrix in Rome, and it dates to the 1st century BCE. What is the connection? Is this just a coincidence? It is actually likely that there is a connection between these two places as far as this kind of architectural ornament goes. This image is of a panel which shows a event from the life of the Buddha, and this is dates to the 1st or 2nd century CE, and it is from Gandhar. Now, this is Gandhar I will be coming to in a minute. It is from Gandhar, and also we can see a similar arrangement, in fact, in a later 10th century panel of Nataraj in Vidisha. Vidisha is in central India in Madhya Pradesh, and you can see a very, very similar kind of pattern of this scrolling vine and flowers. And what is the connection between these? Is this just a coincidence, or is there something more behind it? And I think it becomes clear. The Kushan Empire was established in the early part of the 1st century BCE, and it lasted till somewhere in the 4th century CE. And its high point is really associated with, in the popular mind, definitely with the king Kanishk, and he ruled in the 1st century CE. And this was also the high point of a very particular style of art which we know as the Gandhar style. And the example that I had shown of the Dipankar Jataka panel of the Buddha's life was from this particular culture of Gandhar art. And we can understand how within these territories, and you can see the Kushan Empire encompasses within it a large part of North and Central India, large part of North India certainly, and with an influence going into Central India and Gandhar itself, of course. So it is not at all unthinkable or unlikely that these common motifs were not just a coincidence, but the impact of this style of art which is extending through the territories of the Kushan Empire, and then last into as an influence in Indian art through subsequent centuries as well. When we look at the Qutub complex itself, we of course cannot help but talk about the Qutub Minar itself, this very tall, monumental, striking pillar that was constructed in as an adjunct to the mosque which was built first. And this was built in the late 12th or early 13th centuries. And it is nominally, if we look at it, it's a masna. It's attached to the mosque, the pillar or the tower from which a muezzin calls the faithful to prayer. But actually, if you look at it, this is more in the nature of a victory tower. It's not really a very practical masna for muezzin to climb up, because it's just too tall for that particular purpose. Now, this also had its prototypes in earlier structures that the Ghoris had built in Afghanistan, for instance. And the very most obvious one is the Minar of Jam, and this was constructed by the Ghoris in a valley which is not which is in Afghanistan, the Jam Valley. And this was built just a little bit before the Qutub Minar. And one can see that in its dimensions, its size, it is very, very similar to the Qutub Minar, though instead of being covered in stone, made of stone and covered in stone, it is instead built of brick and covered in some amount of colored tile as well. So it's very the progression from this to the Qutub Minar is actually quite obvious. There are other minars which were built also by the Ghoris in Afghanistan, and among them are two minars that were built in Ghazni, and this is the Behram Shah Minar, and of course the upper part of this has now has broken. There are subsequent damage has happened through wars, through earthquakes, and these minars are in bad condition, but one can get the idea. This minar building was something that the Ghoris really took up in a big way in the 12th century. And it is for when we look at where this minar building comes from, the again one can't help but link it to the of further ancient past of this region itself. And one has to look, I think, at a very iconic minar, which is not talked about very much these days, but because a large part of it has actually collapsed now, but was definitely there when when the Ghoris were building their minars. And this a minar that can be found not very far from Kabul, and it is known as the Minare Chakri. And this too dates from the Gandhar period, the Kushan period, and uh, it's not, of course, as tall as the Qutub Minar or anything. It never was, but it was still pretty tall. You can see the small figures at the base of the minar of some wild stock and people, which give you the scale. So this was a tall, imposing, commemorative pillar, which it is not unlikely, and it's in fact quite plausible that this would have influenced and inspired the later minars built by the Ghoris in Afghanistan, and then coming into India, in India as well, as the Qutub Minar. There are other elements which you can see in the buildings of the Qutub complex, which owe their uh, being to very ancient Indian symbols and motifs. And one of them is on the 14th century building, which is known as the Alai Darwaza. This was built during the reign of Alauddin Khilji in the beginning of the 14th century. And if we look a little closely at the finial on the dome, now this finial has broken, so I'm going to compare it to a finial which is very similar but is more intact now, so that you can get an idea of what it originally would have looked like. This is the finial which is on the tomb of Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq. The lower part of it is a disc like, a striped disc, and this is called the Amalaka. And this Amalaka, the word comes from aula, which is this fruit which has that kind of striped look to it. And on top of that Amalaka is a kalash, that sacred holy water, Ganga water holding pot. And this has, you can see these kind of finials with the Amalaka and the Kalash on other in more either contemporaneous or older Indian temples as well, such as the Chitragupt temple in Khajuraho, which dates from the early 11th century. And you can probably see that that also has a similar finial, and there are several of those on its various shikhars. The Amalaka crowned with a Kalash. This was not the only kind of finial that you see. There is the building which is in the Qutub complex. This is the tomb of Imam Zamin, and this is from the 16th century, the early part of the Mughal Empire that begins in the 16th century. And this has a slightly different composition. It has, again, it has a small uh, Amalaka crowned by the Kalash, and on top of that is a pointed finial. And here you can see that this has its inspiration in other forms, such as the little reliquary boxes, or which are to be found in the Gandhar art, and this dates from the 2nd or 3rd century. And it has this, the main box, the main box, which is like a circular box, and on top of that is a series of progressively shrinking umbrellas, as you may call them, or parasols, and that gives that shape of the finial. Now, I think one should also look at, I think linguistic uh, clues also are important in this. If you look at the Hindi word for a finial, the Hindi word is stupika, and stupika literally means a small stupa. The small stupa, the small reliquary box. A stupa is literally a receptacle which holds a relic of the Buddha or a great Buddhist teacher. And the stupika is a small version of that. So the stupika, the fact that it is used for this kind of finial which is placed on top of buildings, should give us a clue as to the origins of this form itself. It does lie in these small reliquary boxes and relic holding structures that the stupa is. Another decorative motif that we begin to see in the Qutub complex, and it becomes a very stable and much used form in subsequent architecture also, is the lotus. And the lotus, of course, in the vines on the screen of arches was pointed out earlier. This is again from the tomb of Imam Zamin. It's quite a high relief lotus with uh, many petals, a very stylized form of the lotus. And you can definitely, it's carved in marble, and you can definitely see parallels with, again, a Gandhar style, which is this one, which has a multi petaled, uh, several layered lotus. And this, of course, this particular piece was a base on which an image or any other another structure would have stood. So therefore you see the round hole in the middle of it, but the inspiration is clearly very, very similar. And in fact, this, a very similar kind of lotus structure, can be found in the Qutub complex itself, in older parts of the reused elements from older temples, and this is one of those particular temples. Finally, there is another motif that we can see in the Qutub complex, and that is that of the Kalash. The earliest Kalash that at the opening of this talk I had shown was of a pillar which had originally formed one of the temples. Now, this Kalash is carved into the screen of arches, not a reused element from an older temple, but carved afresh for the mosque. It it's a very fairly realistic looking kalash which has leaves coming out of the top of it. Now, this kind of kalash, this was of course built in around 1198 or so. It continued to be used in later structures within the Qutub complex as well, and you can see it. For instance, the mosque was enlarged in the 1230s by a later ruler, Iltutmish, and this, of course, what you can see here is the actual kalash, just as a reference for what a kalash is and its ritual significance. But when the mosque was enlarged by Iltutmish, we see that the kalash remains as an integral part of that structure. Here it is in a very stylized form. It also has some calligraphy on it. So the verses of the Quran are now transferred to the kalash, which brings us to one of the fundamental questions of this kind of borrowing. Because though particularly British colonial art historians, archaeologists, did discuss this question of the use in so-called Islamic architecture, mosques, tombs, etc., of motifs, symbols from the what is they rather simplistically classified as Hindu art or Buddhist art, and what was the significance of this? Of course, they realized that it was Indian stone carvers, Indian artisans who were building these, who were carving these. But how did that relate to what was being commissioned? What was the role of those rulers, those rich patrons who were commissioning these buildings? And it has commonly been felt that when a lotus or a kalash appears on a mosque and a tomb, it is simply a decorative feature. It does not have any greater spiritual or other significance. And I would say that we should broaden our view a little bit, and because the central position of some of these motifs is cannot be ignored. This particular uh, photograph shows the mihrab of a 16th century tomb. It is the tomb of Maulana Jamali, not very far from the Qutub Minar. But it is from a later period. It's from the 16th century, and this Maulana Jamali was a Sufi who lived in this place, and he was buried here. And this is the mihrab. This indicates the direction of prayer. Anybody within the tomb praying for the soul of Maulana Jamali would face this while praying. And it cannot be ignored that, for instance, on either side of the arch, you see two lotuses. Now, the lotus, of course, the significance in Indian culture cannot be ignored. It was a very important part of it, and it is imported into the arches from a very early period. What you see in the middle of the arch, right in the center there at the base, a close up can be seen over here, is really a very, very, in some senses, quite unmistakably recognizable kalash. And that kalash, you can see the shape of the pot, you can see the leaves coming out of it, you can see in the middle what may have been a coconut. And right in the middle of that, of the kalash, is written Allah. And on top of that, on a panel over this, is the kalima, which is the basic creed. Now, this central position that is accorded to the kalash and its association with a very strong religious, spiritual symbolism and affirmation cannot be ignored. So we are talking about how there is an amalgamation of symbols that is taking place, and in many ways, it's definitely the Sufi the importance of the Sufi thought on this, of mingling of different streams, cannot be ignored. And therefore, those are the kind of streams that we cannot help but see in subsequent developments that took place in Indian architecture, in particularly in North Indian architecture, commissioned by a range of people, including imperial patrons of the various Sultanate dynasties, various Mughal rulers, and others as well, noblemen, rich merchants, etc. Anybody who commissioned architecture on a larger scale. These are motifs that are not there only in the Qutub complex. They can be seen in buildings that are there in many, many other places also. And therefore, the Qutub complex gives us a window into some of the formative forces, the formative steps in the creation of this kind of style of architecture, or some of the basis of the various different kinds of styles, and particularly what we have come to know and understand as what we call a composite culture that is taking place. And therefore, a lot of the older um, simplistic constructs like Buddhist architecture, Hindu architecture, Islamic architecture, which seem to be separate from each other, distinct from each other, separated in time and definitely in time and culture, those kind of things break down. And when we talk about the so called Islamic architecture, which the Turks are supposed to have brought into India and implanted over here, we must realize that beyond that, there is a shared culture as well, as I have tried to show, at least in, for instance, in the Gandhar history, which is a shared history of the Kushans and other cross cultural empires like that. And therefore, to imagine that what the Ghoris represent is simply an Islamic style without any reference to their own rootedness in the land is, I think, should is ahistorical to think that way. And we should be looking at some of these ideas to revise, I think, our ideas about what Indian architecture is, what its roots are, and in the decorative arts as well. So I hope that this gives us some new ways of looking at Indian architecture in the context of the Qutub Minar complex. Thank you very much.